Character design is one of the most powerful storytelling tools in video games. Long before a character speaks, fights, or even reveals their motivations, their appearances begins telling the player who they are. A battle-worn knight suggests experience. A tattered cloak hints at hardship. Ornate armor can communicate status, confidence, or power without a single line of dialogue. But for decades, many role-playing games have told a different story when it comes to their female characters. Across countless fantasy worlds, women have often appeared in revealing outfits, exaggerated body proportions, and animations that drew attention to their appearance as much as, or sometimes more than, their role in the story. These weren't isolated creative decisions made by a handful of developers. They became recurring design conventions that appeared across generations of RPGs. What's fascinating isn't simply that these characters existed, it's that the industry kept returning to many of the same ideas for nearly 30 years. Why? Was it the influence of fantasy art and anime? Marketing aimed at a particular audience? The limitations of early technology? Or did each generation simply inherit the creative decisions of the one before it? To understand why oversexualization remains one of gaming's most debated topics today, we first have to understand how these design conventions were established and why they proved so difficult to leave behind. Chapter 1. The industry thought it knew its audience. By the early 1990s, role-playing games were beginning to define themselves. Japanese RPGs were gaining worldwide popularity, while Western RPGs continued evolving from their tabletop roots into expansive digital adventures. Developers were experimenting with larger worlds, memorable characters, and increasingly ambitious storytelling. But alongside these creative breakthroughs came another assumption, one that would influence character design for decades. Many publishers believed their primary audience consisted of teenage boys and young men. Whether that assumption reflected reality or simply industry perception, it shaped countless creative and marketing decisions. Female characters often drew inspiration from contemporary anime and fantasy illustration. Elaborate hairstyles, decorative armor, and idealized body proportions made characters visually distinctive on limited hardware. Technical limitations also encouraged artists to rely on bold silhouettes and recognizable archetypes instead of subtle facial expressions or detailed animation. Some exaggeration served practical purposes, but practicality wasn't the whole story. Marketing increasingly emphasized spectacle. Box art, magazine advertisements, and promotional artwork frequently showcased female characters in revealing clothing because they attracted attention in crowded stores. Fantasy artwork from earlier decades had already popularized the image of the heavily armored male hero standing beside the lightly armored female warrior, and many RPGs adopted that visual language without questioning it. The result wasn't simply a handful of revealing costumes. It was the gradual establishment of expectations. Female characters became more likely to occupy familiar archetypes: the healer, the mage, the love interest, or the mysterious companion. Their appearance often emphasized attractiveness before personality. Male characters, while frequently exaggerated themselves, were generally designed to communicate strength, power, or heroism rather than sexuality. Looking back, the biggest missed opportunity wasn't that RPGs embraced stylized fantasy. Fantasy always exaggerated reality. The problem was that those exaggerations became increasingly one-sided. Once audiences became familiar with these conventions, future developers inherited a visual language that few studios felt any reason to challenge. The industry had discovered a formula that appeared to work, and success has a habit of becoming tradition. Chapter 2. When success reinforces tradition. The 2000s should have been the decade that challenged those conventions. Technology had improved dramatically. Fully voiced characters, cinematic cutscenes, and expressive animations gave developers new ways to communicate personality. RPGs were becoming larger, more emotional, and more sophisticated than ever before. At the same time, the audience was changing. More women were playing games, online communities were expanding, and RPGs were reaching a broader global audience. Yet many of the visual conventions established during the previous decade largely remained intact. Instead of replacing spectacle with deeper characterization, many studios simply presented both together. Female protagonists became more common, and many received stronger writing than ever before. But revealing alternate costumes, flirtatious dialogue, and promotional artwork that emphasized physical attractiveness remained common marketing tools. Publishers had little reason to abandon strategies that continued generating attention and sales. This wasn't simply creative stubbornness, it was commercial momentum. Once a design philosophy proves profitable, industries rarely abandon it overnight. Looking back, the decade's greatest strength wasn't storytelling. The greatest weakness was assuming that stronger writing automatically solved deeper issues of representation. It didn't. Players could appreciate a well-written female character while still questioning why her design appeared to prioritize visual appeal over practical world building. The contradiction wasn't disappearing. It was becoming easier to notice. Chapter 3: When representation meets expectation. By the 2010s, RPGs had become cinematic experiences capable of telling stories that rivaled film and television. Female protagonists appeared more frequently than ever before. Many were intelligent, capable, emotionally complex, and central to the narratives. On paper, representation was improving. In practice, however, many older design conventions remained. Downloadable costumes often leaned toward revealing alternatives. Marketing campaigns continued highlighting physical attractiveness. Camera angles, animations, and promotional artwork sometimes reinforced the same visual priorities established decades earlier. This created an unusual contradiction. Players increasingly praised female characters for their depth while simultaneously criticizing how those same characters were presented visually. The conversation itself had changed. The debate was no longer whether women belonged in RPGs. It had become whether visual design was keeping pace with advances in storytelling. Developers were now faced with an audience that was more diverse and more willing to question long-standing conventions. Some players defended fan service as harmless tradition. Others argued that traditions no longer reflected the audience RPGs had grown to serve. Neither side had appeared overnight. Both inherited decades of expectations. Chapter 4: A genre at a crossroad. By the 2020s, RPGs found themselves balancing two very different ideas of what fantasy should look like. Some developers embraced practical armor, varied body types, and character designs built around personality rather than spectacle. Others continued celebrating stylized fantasy and fan service, arguing that exaggeration had always been a part of the genre's identity. Neither approach existed in isolation. Both reflected different interpretations of the genre's history. The audience had changed dramatically. Developers no longer design games for a single demographic, but for a global community with widely different expectations. As a result, every new RPG entered an ongoing conversation about representation, artistic freedom, immersion, and commercial success. Looking back across 3 decades, it becomes clear that oversexualization wasn't created by one controversial game or one studio. It emerged gradually. Each generation inherited ideas from the one before it. Some challenged those ideas, others reinforced them. The legacy wasn't simply revealing costumes. It was the normalization of a design language that became increasingly difficult to question. History explains how we arrived here, but history alone doesn't tell us whether those decisions ultimately benefited the genre. Did these design conventions genuinely improve RPGs? Did they help developers tell better stories? Or did they become creative shortcuts that limited how female characters were imagined in fantasy worlds? To answer those questions, we need to move beyond history and start evaluating the legacy those decisions left behind. Chapter 5: Fantasy, fan service, and the line between them. After examining how these design conventions developed over several decades, we are left with a more important question. What did these design choices actually do to the RPG genre? Because the discussion around oversexualization is not simply about whether a character wears revealing clothing. Fantasy has always been built around exaggeration. Heroes wield impossible weapons, warriors survive impossible battles, and worlds are filled with creatures and abilities that should never exist in reality. Exaggeration itself is not the problem. The more important question is what exaggeration communicates. A character wearing oversized armor and carrying a massive weapon tells the player something. It suggests power, danger, or experience. A character with an unusual appearance may communicate mystery, status, or personality. Character design is a form of storytelling. Before a character speaks a single word, players are already forming an impression of who that character is. This is where criticism of oversexualization begins. The issue is not simply that attractive characters exist. Attraction, confidence, and sexuality have always been parts of human expression, and there is nothing inherently wrong with including those elements in games. The concern comes from repetition. When female characters are repeatedly introduced through designs that emphasize their bodies before their personalities, it can create an imbalance of how those characters are presented compared to the male counterparts. A male character's exaggerated design is often used to communicate something about what they can do. They are strong, they are dangerous, they are legendary. A female character's exaggerated design has often been used to communicate something about how they should be viewed. They are beautiful, they are desirable, they are appealing. Neither approach is necessarily realistic. Both rely on fantasy, but they communicate very different priorities. And over time, those priorities began influencing how players interpreted these characters before the story even began. Chapter 6. When appearance begins to tell the wrong story. This leads to one of the biggest criticisms surrounding oversexualized character design: the possibility that appearance begins overshadowing identity. Role-playing games are built around connection. Players spend dozens, sometimes hundreds of hours with characters. They learn their histories, their fears, their motivations, and the choices that define them. The strongest RPG characters are rarely remembered because of their appearance alone. They are remembered because of who they are, their struggles, their personalities, their relationship with the player and the world around them. But when a player's introduction places heavy emphasis on their physical appeal, it can create a disconnect between their writing and their presentation. A game may tell players, this character is intelligent, capable, and complex. But if the camera, costume design, or marketing repeatedly emphasize the appearance first, another message can unintentionally be created. This character exists to be looked at. That contradiction became one of the defining debates of modern RPG design. Because the industry was improving in one area while sometimes falling behind in another. Female characters were receiving stronger writing, more important roles, and more narrative depth than ever before, yet some of the visual conventions surrounding them remained rooted in older assumptions. The result was a strange contradiction. Representation was increasing, but the way those characters were presented was still being questioned. Chapter 7. When creativity meets commerce. However, character design does not exist separately from the realities of game development. Games are commercial products. Behind every character is a team of artists, writers, directors, marketers, and publishers making decisions under financial pressure. For decades, attractive character designs were effective marketing tools. A memorable character could sell a game. A striking image could attract attention off of a store shelf. A provocative trailer could generate discussion online. In a competitive industry, anything that captures attention has value. This is why fan service became such a complicated topic. On one hand, fan service can be a legitimate creative choice. Games are allowed to be playful. They are allowed to be exaggerated. They are allowed to embrace fantasy. Many players enjoy characters who are visually striking, dramatic, or intentionally unrealistic. But the problems begin once the design philosophy becomes the default. When every generation repeats the same visual shortcuts, those choices stop feeling like creative experimentation and start feeling like expectation. A character can be attractive without being reduced to attractiveness. A character can be sexual without sexuality becoming their defining feature. The difference lies in whether the design serves the character or whether the character exists to serve the design. Chapter 8. The other side of the debate. This debate became even more complicated as games introduced more customization options. Alternate costumes, downloadable content, and additional character designs gave players more freedom than ever before. In many ways, it was a positive development. Customization allows players to express themselves and engage with characters in personal ways. However, it also created new questions. When optional outfits repeatedly shift female characters towards more revealing designs, while male characters receive alternate versions focused on style, power, or personality, players began asking what those choices revealed about the industry priorities. Were these designs expanding a character, or were they simply using that character as a marketing tool? This question became especially important as RPGs reached larger and more diverse audiences. The player base was no longer the same audience publishers imagined decades earlier. Gaming had changed. The people playing RPGs had changed. The expectations around representation changed alongside them. At the same time, it is important to recognize that the conversation is not as simple as fan service is bad. Many players argue that fantasy should remain a place where exaggeration and creativity are unrestricted. They argue that fictional characters do not need to reflect reality. They argue that attractive designs can exist alongside meaningful storytelling. And there is truth in that perspective. A character can be beautiful and still be complex. A character can be confident in their sexuality and still have agency. A character can wear revealing clothing and still be memorable for reasons beyond appearance. The issue has never been the existence of those characters. The issue has been the lack of variety. When one type of portrayal dominates for decades, it limits the possibilities available to creators and audiences. The solution is not removing one type of character. The solution is making room for more. Looking across the history of RPGs, one of the clearest lessons is that character design carries responsibility. Every choice communicates something. The clothes a character wears, the way the camera frames them, the way they move, the way they are advertised. All of these elements shape how players understand them. The future of RPG character design does not require abandoning fantasy. Fantasy has always been about imagination. The challenge is expanding that imagination. A genre capable of creating countless worlds should also be capable of creating countless types of heroes. Female characters can be powerful without being invincible. They can be attractive without being defined by attractiveness. They can be vulnerable without being helpless. They can be complicated without being reduced to a single trait. Because the strongest characters are not remembered because of what they look like. They are remembered because of what they represent. After 3 decades, the discussion around oversexualization in RPGs has moved beyond simple questions of costumes and appearances. It has become a discussion about design philosophy, about audience expectations, and about the relationship between creativity and commerce, about what developers choose to emphasize when introducing players to a new character. The history of RPGs was not shaped by one decision or one generation. It was shaped by thousands of choices repeated over time. Some created beloved characters, some created lasting problems, and some created debates that continue today. The question facing modern RPGs is not whether fantasy should include beauty, attraction, or fan service. The question is whether those elements should continue defining so many characters before players ever discover who they truly are. Because every generation inherits the choices of the one before it, and every generation gets the opportunity to decide what deserves to become a legacy. If you want to see more of my content, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss my new videos. Thanks guys for watching, and as always, stay safe everyone. Bye for now.